Okay, folks, so here we are with the second lecture of the week on representation. And representation is obviously a critical component of thinking about collaborative policymaking planning, who can speak for whom. And the absence of representation, as the folks of Washington, D.C. Express very clearly, is problematic, right? And that's true in electoral democracy, it's true in participatory democracy of the varieties we've been talking about this semester. But it's really important to think about who can, does, is speaking for whom. And one thing we might start with is thinking about, why do we care about representation? Why is it important to us? What are the issues that make representation something we should pay explicit attention to in our decision making? Huh. If we were together, wouldn't that be nice? When I do this class normally in person, there's a really short little experiment or exercise I do with folks. Um, that we unfortunately can't do now, but I'm sure many of you have done this. Most of you even perhaps have done this at some point in life, where it's called broken telephone, where you start with a phrase or yeah, some kind of sentence and whisper to the first person, they pass it on to the second person, they whisper it on to the third person, and it kind of makes it around some group of people. And of course, the fun with the exercise or the fun with the broken telephone game, whatever we want to call it, is that by the end, the sentence is never really, well, often it doesn't in any way resemble what it started as. And as fun as that is, it's also illustrative, right? It's illustrative of some of the challenges with representation, or one of the challenges with representation, that incomplete information can be passed along, right? The telephone is broken. The translation is often garbled. It is often missed. It's imperfect, right? And so our representatives don't always get a full sense of really what we care about, what we need, what our interests are. And so we can call that a broken telephone or incomplete information challenge. Next is really interesting. I think it's a principal agent problem. And I'm going to ask you, or put a supplementary video up that's from Freakonomics. I don't always love all their stuff, but some of the stuff is good, and this one I think is really illustrative of this principal agent problem. Long and short of a principal agent problem is that the interest priorities of the principal, that is to say, of the stakeholder group, those of us that share a set of interests that we are hoping are being represented in some process, that we don't always have the same interests as our representatives or our agents, right? And the more a representative comes from a constituency, the more a representative can speak on behalf of a constituency. Frankly, I think the less those principal agent problems may exist, but we always have to keep that in mind, right? To what degree does the agent speak on behalf of their constituents or those they are supposed to be representing? So again, please take a look at that short video, supplementary video. It's short, and it's, I think, really illustrative of this. So the next issue is in-group heterogeneity. And so let's assume we can somehow rectify or solve the issues of perhaps differences in interests and priorities between principals and agents, or those representing and those being represented. There's often a lot of variety within any group, right? Within any group that is being represented. And how do we reconcile that, or at least come to some sense of what our representative should be speaking to, on what prioritization and so on they should be giving? And so I'd encourage you, this is a good thought exercise. Think about your issues, what you care most about as a student. And of course, I recognize fully you have a lot of issues, priorities, interests beyond as a student. But just think about it for a moment, just as a student, put your student hat on. What do you care most about? Are those the same issues, priorities as other students? I would suspect that in some areas, perhaps yes. I would suspect that some other subset of students probably have very similar interests and priorities as you. But if we look across the full spectrum of students, there's going to be some heterogeneity. Some people are going to care more about some things. Some people are going to disagree on certain things. And that raises a whole issue around, if we are thinking about representation of and from students, what does that look like? Who is a representative of or from students, given all that heterogeneity? So certainly in-group heterogeneity can be a major challenge. And of course, part of the issue with heterogeneity is that we may align or misalign on different issues. And certainly, not that I think all issues break down neatly to this kind of liberal conservative divide at all. But it's useful, I think, as a kind of construct, as a way to think about this, right? And so it's very common for us to think about people who maybe are economically liberal and socially liberal, but others that are economically liberal, socially conservative. others that are economically conservative but socially liberal, and others that are, of course, conservative both socially and economically. Um, and the fact that we can't so easily talk about a liberal population and a conservative population, but that in fact there's heterogeneity based on the fact that we might line up on one issue and not on others, and so one could, for example, be um, pro death penalty, but also very economically liberal, right? Believe in a strong state in terms of support, or conversely, be very pro-life, but economically or fiscally liberal. There's a lot of possibility here, and so therefore it becomes hard to represent groups. The next is choosing a representative. And sometimes that's obvious, so if you're the business community within a, say, given town or city, your representative may be the sort of president of the Chamber of Commerce or somebody like that, and they more or less just kind of have that inherent legitimacy. But in other cases, it's really far from clear, right? So who can speak for whom? How do we choose who's going to speak for a group? And in particular, a group that's heterogeneous and less organized. That's a big issue, is how do we choose somebody? Last but not least is the cost of having an agent, right? And so in many cases that may be zero, maybe sort of a cost that at least isn't something that we share. They're volunteer, and so the cost is on them, and so on. But in other cases, our agent may cost resources, time, money, whatever it is, and so it's something we have to think about. So, these are challenges. I think it relates to the conceptions of what representation looks like. I gave you a draft article I've been working on very much in this area of representation. I'm not going to go into the content of that article. I hope you get a chance to read it separately from this as a way to think about it. But part of what it's about is thinking about what are different ways in which we might conceptualize representation that might, depending on the form, could address some of these challenges, and in other ways perhaps exacerbate some of them. And so I encourage you certainly to read that and think about that. For now, however, what I'd like to do is to go on to think about if representatives are so challenging, if the notion of representation is so challenging, then why have representatives? And one important critical reason is the impracticality of everybody being directly involved, right, in every decision. And especially if we want to think about more deliberative engagement. That is to say that we want to think about how do we involve people in thick participation. And on that note, I showed this graph earlier this semester, but I think there's a relatively inverse relationship between the level of deliberation, how thick it is, and the number of participants. So that as it gets thicker, as our engagement, we seek to involve people more extensively and intensively, and really want them to be a part of a deliberative process of learning, exploring, devising. Then inherently we end up with less people being able to be at the table. And so, the logistical realities become that we need some form of representation. But there are other good reasons to have representatives. So the next three are all about specialization. And the first one is the substantive expertise. So we hope that those that are representing us, those that are speaking on our behalf, either will, going in a priori, have some form of expertise, will have expertise that allows them to be effective, knowing the substance of the issue, and able to speak to it and argue on it and represent it as they speak to our interests. In other cases, they may not go in with that expertise, but we expect them to learn as part of the process. And so they're going to become subject matter experts, essentially learning for us, right? There are other forms of specialization though as well, right? So the next one is just that preparation. It's basically what I just said, right? Is that they are going to learn, that they're going to invest, that they're going to become good at what they're doing through preparing adequately for it. And that kind of bridges nicely into the third, which is process tactical knowledge. So we hope that they get that substantive knowledge. We expect them to become substantive experts, but also procedural experts. And sometimes we might choose representatives on that basis, right? Lawyers are famously chosen often to be representatives. And I'm not saying lawyers are always the right people to speak on behalf of others, certainly far from it. But that often they do have some expertise in that area, given different contexts. But that they're, in general, we might choose somebody who's done this before. We might choose somebody that just is good sort of tactically at engaging in this kind of process. Last but not least is representation is better than nothing. And that might sound kind of like a sellout or whatever, but that if we have to choose between having nobody at the table in a deliberative, thick process and somebody, then we're better off having somebody, right? And so even though it's imperfect, representation is better than nothing. We looked much earlier in the semester at Fung's democracy cube, and one of the things that Fung accentuates or pays attention to is how do we select representatives, right? Or participants, but in many ways implicit within that notion of participant selection is representative selection, is really what we mean. And there's a range, and I don't want to go through the whole thing again here, but there's a range from kind of the folks being there because they, well, at the far end, left end of this spectrum of because they're expert administrators, because they have the most substantive knowledge, expertise, and they're there because of that, all the way through, of course, to, well, the far end is diffuse public sphere, where there is really no representation. But if we go in one step from that to open self-selection, as we talked about, and so thinking about the way in which representation is chosen is critically important. And Urbanati and Warren go, well, I wouldn't say further, but think about it in a related, similar way. But they classify on this sort of breakdown to these notions of non-electoral democratic representation of self-authorized representatives and citizen representatives. And self-authorized representatives are essentially groups that make claims of representing others. And this is really important, right? This relates extremely well to what we talked about last week with civil society, right? And so we have folks that are essentially making a self-claim to speaking for others. And so I think about advocacy organizations, NGOs, interest groups, and that they can function in many ways as counterpoints, or counterpolitics is the term they use, to the more traditional electoral democratic institutions, or conversely, as as positive sort of as participants in deliberative processes. But that they essentially are self-authorizing. And then we have citizen representatives, rather individuals that are self-selected or selected to represent their communities. And so we think there about models like citizen juries we talked about, deliberative polling, focus groups, where essentially we're selecting some random set. They're not organized as a civil society group. They're rather showing up as a random sort of sample, or at least some kind of cross section of the population that's not organized in any way. Carson gives us a criteria for effective participation, right? And encourages us to think about how participants should reflect the cross-section of the population, right? They should be selected in a way that's not open to manipulation or some kind of bias. And in some ways makes the case that random selection offers the best chance of achieving that outcome. There's also this argument that outcomes should be focused on community and not self-interest, that participants aren't asked what they want personally, but rather what they consider as appropriate in their role as citizen. I think that's more debatable, more questionable. That's certainly not the model of, say, consensus building, some of the other models we looked at this semester, where we actually invite people for a very different reason, because they explicitly do speak to a interest of a group. And I'd say that's a debate. It's an ongoing debate, but it's an important one. And so I include it here as a way for you to think about what is the responsibility of representatives. Are they there in a collaborative process kind of as for the greater good, or are they there because they are actually pursuing self-interest? Not individual self-interest necessarily, we hope not, but the self-interest of those they are purportedly representing. Okay, so this is very much related to the article I shared, the draft article I'm working on representation. Jane Mansbridge introduces these various forms of representation and accountability, and I think they should resonate with you. And by the way, Jenny is talking about representation in electoral context. I'm, among other things, translating this or trying to translate this into thinking about non-electoral context, the kind of representative process we looked at this semester. But I think it does translate well. I think it's very germane to this world we live in, or at least parts of it are, in terms of thinking about principal-agent relationships in these collaborative, deliberative, non-electoral processes. And so what is the first model she presents? Is this promissory, right? So representatives are chosen on the basis of what's promised up front. What do they say they're going to do? And that's their mandate, right? They are responsible to their constituents on the basis of what they promised a priori. Anticipatory model would be that representatives make decisions based on what they think people want, right? They're concerned about how they're going to be judged later. So they're concerned as much about the post hoc. Am I going to survive review when I go back to the constituency I'm supposed to be representing. So in that model, there's much more of an emphasis on ongoing communication and accountability, right? I'm not doing necessarily what I promised up front, but I'm going to kind of make sure that they're okay with it, so that when they comes time to judge me, I've met their standards. And then the third, and the one I'm most interested in the article I shared with you, is this notion of gyroscopic, right? Where we share some like-mindedness, some qualities, some values, and so therefore I have more leeway, more leverage to change the position, certainly, as a result of deliberative process, because you chose me on the basis of some shared principles, some shared identity, and so on and so forth. And so as we start to wrap this section on representation, selection of representation, let's turn to some advice. And so one would be some advice for constituents on how can they manage their representatives. And one certainly is to take the selection process seriously, right? So think about how you're choosing representatives insofar as you have any say in that choice. And second would be to think about how we monitor them, right? How do we try to hold them accountable and make sure they're doing what they say they're going to do and are representing our interests truly. And so when we're doing the selection, we probably want to be thinking about, do we have relatively aligned interests, right? In other words, can we avoid that principal agent problem, among other things, by making sure we're kind of on the same page? Do they have that expertise, right? Either substantive or process that's going to help them to be effective? Do they have status and relationships vis-a-vis the parties they're going to be engaging with, right? Can they actually kind of stand with some stature and be respected of the process? Do they have a reputation, right? How do we select effectively? Well, one way is through thinking about or looking for folks that have a good reputation, right? Who's going to be a good representative? Who's got a good reputation? I'll leave it there. And last but not least, it's much more with the monitoring. Is what is the not only how do we monitor, but what is the way in which we're going to evaluate success and failure, right? What is the accountability that's baked into it? On the flip side, if you're a representative, how do you take your role seriously? Well, one is certainly to appreciate, understand what is your source of legitimacy, right? Why have people invested their trust in you? Is it on the basis of shared values where you have a little more leeway in position because you have the shared values, or is it more perhaps promissory that they're investing their trust in you because you've made certain commitments to them, very substantive commitments, and so that's certainly one thing you want to do, is understand your source of legitimacy. Second is, and again, when it's anticipatory model, if you think about Mansbridge's model, we certainly want to make sure we're emphasizing dialogue and ongoing dialogue, and how do we kind of carry our constituents along with us and make sure that what we're doing is acceptable to them, and so that ongoing dialogue, or caucusing is another way we put it. And related to that very much is understanding, especially when a group is very heterogeneous, is that there is a heterogeneity within our stakeholder group, within the constituency we're representing. So how do we resolve that, right? How do we work with the group to arrive at what is acceptable, what is not, what we're going to do? And last but not least is how do we, and again, especially when we're talking about groups where it's more of an anticipatory model, how do we walk them through what we're doing? How do we hold their hand as we go along and keep them abreast and aware and supportive of what we're doing as we go through deliberative process and what we're agreeing to on their behalf? And last but not least here is a way I think we can ameliorate some of this, is by thinking about how we can support or complement the kind of thick deliberation where representatives are at the table on our behalf with some thin participatory tools. And so use the example here of affordable housing, where, say, an advocacy organization involved in advocating for affordable housing is involved in a much more deliberative consensus building process with a relatively limited number of other stakeholder groups, and there's somebody there speaking on behalf of the wider housing community, and how it's, can be hard at times to carry along or bring along others, and so we might complement that with some kind of thin tools, like in this case, some kind of information campaigns that would provide information and explanation for what's going on and what we're doing to lower income residents. Okay, so I hope this has really helped you to make sense of what representation means, how it can be legitimated, what are some of the considerations both in choosing a representative but also serving as a representative, and so on and so forth.